All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight for our Museum After Hours program. My name is Sarah Bell. I am the director of the Kansas Museum of History. I am so pleased to
Hello,
welcome
everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight for our Museum After Hours program. My name is Sarah Bell. I am the director of the Kansas Museum of History.
Technical difficulties. You can't expect a Zoom presentation without them. All right. Well, let me try that again. My name is Sarah Bell. I'm the director of the Kansas Museum of History, and I am so pleased to have with us tonight Merle Riedel for a presentation of A New Generation of Veterans, Stories from Iraq and Afghanistan. Merle works as a fiscal analyst and is a retired major from the Kansas Army National Guard. Prior to working as a fiscal analyst, Merle was a director of grants at Humanities Kansas and assistant curator at the Kansas Museum of History. In 2018, he was coordinator for Kansas Stories of the Vietnam War, a statewide oral history project involving 12 communities conducting 74 interviews with Vietnam veterans. Merle grew up in Tipton, located in Mitchell County, Kansas. He received a bachelor's degree in history from Kansas State University with an emphasis on Central European history, and a master's degree in museum studies from the University of Kansas. He lives in Topeka with his wife and 9-year-old golden doodle, Harper. Merle served 22 years in the Kansas Army National Guard as a field artillery officer. His career involved deployments and tours in Iraq, Egypt, and Germany. His positions included battery commander, battalion executive officer, brigade senior operations officer. Merle will be giving the presentation tonight, and as always with these Museum After Hours programs, there will be time for questions at the end. But you can drop your questions in the chat bar at any time throughout tonight's presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Merle.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm gonna try to get my slideshow up. All right. Should be seeing a slideshow with a picture of myself on it. I am Merle Riedel. I am a Humanities Kansas speaker. I would like to thank the State Historical Society and the Kansas Historical Foundation for making this event possible today. As Sarah mentioned, years ago, I worked as a curator at the Kansas Historical Society. I studied history at Kansas State University and KU. And I'm just generally fascinated with how war impacts society and our collective memory of such conflicts. Today, I'll discuss A New Generation of Veterans, Stories from Iraq and Afghanistan, which is part of the Humanities Kansas 21st Century Civics Initiative to lead conversations about American democracy and the shared responsibility of citizenship. I typically take this moment to ask how many people in the room are veterans. So the virtual format doesn't always lend itself so well to that. But I would note I've given this presentation a couple times because I think it's important to talk about these issues, these wars. And it's always interesting to see who's in the audience. Most of the time, there'll always be about 10% of the audience is Vietnam veterans or veterans from the Cold War period. And there's often a lot of spouses from deceased veterans that attend who just sort of feel compelled to learn more about these items. You can see a picture there. That is me. That's me and fellow lieutenants at the Radwaniyah Palace complex just outside of Baghdad. We served with Alpha Battery, 2nd of the 130th Field Artillery Battalion that's located in Hiawatha, Kansas. That unit deployed to Iraq in 2003 as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom II, which was the first force to arrive in Iraq after the initial invasion. We were the first Kansas National Guard unit to deploy for combat since the Vietnam War. So at that time, the idea of National Guard units deploying was really sort of novel and groundbreaking. And today it's really quite common. Some details about the people in that picture with me on my, what would be my right in the photograph, your left looking at the photograph, that is Mark McLeod. He was a program manager for a firm in Kansas City, Kansas. And on my left, sort of your right looking at the picture, that's Alan Vonderschmidt, who was an information technology consultant at Sprint. And at that time, we kind of ranged in age from 25 to 30 years old. So why is it important to tell these stories now? So 2021 marked the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which led to these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Much of the story of these conflicts remains untold, and more significantly, it's beginning to fade from memory. They were some of the longest wars in American history. They shaped an entire generation of veterans that were part of civil society at the time, or they are in transition back to civil society now. And we generally hope that you will engage veterans telling their stories. Today, we'll review some key events of these conflicts, and the intent is to kind of give people some framework so that when they engage in conversations with these veterans, they have a general sense of what terminology means. We'll discuss some methods for sparking these conversations with veterans. And I'd just like to remind people that these conflicts had a deep and lasting impact. So we always ask people to be respectful of the voices of others. As Sarah mentioned, I am a retired major. I served in the Kansas National Guard for 22 years. I was assigned to units in Paola, Hiawatha, Wichita, and Manhattan. I did deploy overseas three times to Iraq, Egypt, and Germany. During my deployment to Iraq, my unit provided base defense to U.S. Special Forces at the Baghdad International Airport. Additionally, I have two brothers, a sister, a nephew, and a cousin that served in the U.S. Army. Three of us actually deployed to Iraq from 2003 to 2004, and I often joke with my mom that she has a substantial investment in the future of the country of Iraq, and she really does not find that all that funny. I'm often asked if I come from a military family, and my response is not really. I had a grandfather that served in World War II, but probably more relevant is I had an oldest brother who was the first to enlist that discovered that military provided a college education. And the rest of us generally felt that if my oldest brother could do it, the rest of us could probably do it too. Though I didn't realize it at the time, my deployment to Iraq would shape much of the rest of my life. My deployment has become a waypoint in my life experience, with much of my memories organized around pre-Iraq and post-Iraq. While I was in Baghdad, I met this gentleman in the photograph. His name is Ahmed. He was educated in Iraq as an engineer. He was part of the Southern Shiite resistance against the Saddam Hussein regime in Basra after the Gulf War. He fought with U.S. forces during the 2023 invasion, and he provided security on a U.S. Special Forces base at my camp. So we got to work together every day. He was the father of three children, and he constantly asked me about a place called Kansas and what it was like to live in a democracy, which is a surprisingly difficult question to answer when you've never lived in a place that wasn't a democracy. So in this picture, I actually convinced him to wear a t-shirt from my hometown in Tipton, Kansas, so that I could take a picture and share it with family members. As Sarah mentioned, in 2018, I coordinated Kansas Stories of the Vietnam War, which was a statewide oral history project at Humanities Kansas to document the stories of Vietnam veterans during the 60th anniversary of the conflict. It's difficult to define exactly when the Vietnam War began, but 1968 is sort of widely considered a significant year to commemorate in that conflict, as that was the year with the greatest number of U.S. service members in Vietnam. And so I bring that project up because while doing it, I came to realize three things. Telling your story can be a powerful way to deal with buried emotions and pay respect to your brothers and sisters in combat. The American public often has what I would call an unclear understanding of war, but there is certainly a desire to learn more. And finally, memories fade or even sometimes become fused with popular notions of these events. So now is the time to capture and document these stories. Just want to share some statistics related to the post 9/11 veterans. And I'm always a little resistant to comparing sort of Vietnam generations, or veteran generations, but I think this is a useful tool. You can see on the left there, you have the post 9/11 conflicts, which lasted 20 years. And when I say post 9/11 veterans, I'm primarily referencing those that served in Iraq and Afghanistan. However, other minor operations occurred in other countries. So for those post 9/11 conflicts, they lasted a total of 20 years. Between 1.9 million and 3 million US service members served in those conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Over half of those individuals deployed more than once. So a typical deployment might last 6 months or up to 12 months, and many of those returned multiple times. 6,800 US service member casualties, so a little over or near 7,000 individuals died in those conflicts. And approximately 0.7% of the American population serves in the military today or during this period. So if we look at World War II, that was a 4-year conflict. 16 million service members served in World War II. A little over 400,000 US service members were casualties. And during that period, 11% of the American population served in the war, served in World War II. So a shift of 11% of the American population serving during World War II to 0.7 or less than 1% of the population serving during the post 9/11 conflicts is a significant shift. And I often ask people, what do you think accounts for this shift? And not surprisingly, it's really primarily driven by the draft. So during World War II, we had a draft implemented, which means that a much larger percent of American society served in these conflicts. So then I always follow up with what is the impact of less than 1% of the population serving in those post 9/11 conflicts? What's the impact of such a smaller percentage? Ultimately, what it really means is there's far less members of civil society that have a direct relationship with someone serving in these conflicts. So they have a perhaps less firsthand knowledge of what events might be occurring. I'd say it is also interesting to note that of that 0.7% of Americans that serve today, a large portion come from what we would call military families. So in other words, there may be multiple siblings serving at one time, or even multiple generations, a father and a daughter. There may be an uncle and a nephew that's serving all simultaneously. And this is increasingly comprising a larger percent of those that serve. So as I mentioned, during World War II, we had a draft which accounted for a large proportion of the civil society serving. Today, we rely on an all-volunteer force, which is generally considered more advantageous, as that is a professional force. However, there are general concerns about the equity of an all-volunteer force that is increasingly concentrated on what we would call those military families, and draws primarily from the economic disadvantaged. The modern volunteer force uses primarily educational benefits as a recruiting tool. So what does that mean? What that means is those that are not in need of such benefits are really less recruited. So we primarily recruit from among those that are in need of educational benefits. You go to war with the army you have, not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time. And that's a fairly famous quote that occurred during those post 9/11 conflicts. That was a quote by Donald Rumsfeld, who was US Secretary of Defense in 2004. He made that quote while touring Iraq. He provided this response to a US soldier that was asking why the army lacked vehicles with additional armor. And it's really sort of it made its rounds in the media at the time, and it's really sort of a shocking question in that the majority of times when the Secretary of Defense is traveling around the battlefield, his public engagements are fairly scripted, and there's usually not a challenging question that's going to be asked. However, in this instance, this was a relatively challenging question. And his response, you go to the war with the army you have, not the army you might want, really speaks to a new form of warfare that existed that was known as counterinsurgency. That emerged in Iraq and Afghanistan after the initial invasion. The enemy, who didn't possess the same type of sophisticated arms and munitions, used improvised explosive devices or hidden roadside bombs to engage U.S. service members or coalition service members to attack them. And the lack of armor meant that vehicles were vulnerable to that attack. So U.S. Department of Defense had invested money and energy into a process of adding armor to those vehicles, but it took time. And the lack of armor indicates that the Department of Defense had not adequately planned or anticipated the type of operations that were going to occur. In fact, most evidence indicates that the U.S. really had no plans to invade Iraq prior to September 11th, which is sometimes counter to what people believe today. We did fight a Gulf War, but really, for the large part, the U.S. had no plans to invade Iraq until after September 11th, and even had not even considered it as an option until well into 2002, almost a year after the events of September 11th. So I just want to briefly, before we get too far, and talk a little bit about the region that these events occurred. Post 9/11 conflicts largely occurred in a region referred to as the Middle East. This is a geopolitical region comprised of approximately 18 countries that connects the continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe. The most populous countries in this region are Egypt, Iran, and Turkey, while Saudi Arabia remains the largest by land area. Climate is generally hot, except for some cold mountainous regions in Afghanistan. Significant rivers in the area include the Nile, which runs in Africa, and the Tigris and Euphrates River in Iraq. And they actually run through an area in Iraq that's known as the Fertile Crescent. It was among the first regions for mass farming and large-scale civilization. Significant bodies of water in the area include the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. And the Red Sea is quite significant because as that leads up into Egypt, it connects with the Suez Canal, which provides a significant amount of commercial transit. And you'll even hear in the news today, this is an area of concern, being the Red Sea and the ability to move goods through this area. Most countries around the Persian Gulf have vast reserves of what? It's petroleum or oil. For years, oil was the primary economic engine of this region and provided a global supply of relatively cheap oil. Oil extraction in the Middle East began in earnest in the 1950s by British companies, mainly in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. So the precise origins of the post 9/11 conflicts can be a little difficult to determine, but probably the most logical place to begin is the Persian Gulf War, occurring in the 1990s. So in August 1990s, Iraq, at the direction of President Saddam Hussein, invaded neighboring country of Kuwait. By January of 1991, U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush led a multinational coalition to remove the Iraqi presence from Kuwait. In February of 1991, the coalition pushes Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, actually crosses the border and just begins to enter Kuwait, and then the coalition forces halt. Coalition determines that the objectives are met and does not advance to Baghdad. Saddam Hussein was effectively left in power. And opposition to Hussein in Iraq, or those that were friendly to the coalition forces, faced brutal oppression after that period. President Bush actually faced criticism for not proceeding and capturing Baghdad, and many ask why he didn't. And it's a good question. Bush argued that the coalition was really built on a limited objective of liberating Kuwait, and he was concerned that further action would fracture the alliance. Herbert Walker Bush was a coalition builder, relied very intentionally on allies, and he was concerned that any further progress and some of the allies or key allies, some of the European allies or even Saudi Arabia, would begin to resist the idea of invading an Arab country. And he was concerned that they would fall away from the coalition and the U.S. would end up going at it alone. Even then, at the time, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney concurred with Bush, expressing concern that additional casualties would be significant and suggested that the US would become bogged down in occupying and governing Iraq, which is interesting because in some respects, we would actually know exactly how this would play out if we were to invade Iraq, because we would do it within a decade. Generally, the unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country, such as Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, is considered destabilizing, regionally, if not globally. Saddam Hussein attempted to legitimize this invasion of Kuwait as simply retaking a region that was once part of Iraq. However, most scholars believe today that the invasion was motivated by an effort to eliminate debt owed to Kuwait resulting from the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. So then we move on to September 11th attacks, which were really sort of the motivation for a lot of these later conflicts. On September 11th, 2001, terrorists fly hijacked airplanes into the World Trade Center and Pentagon, resulting in 2,977 fatalities. The terrorists are part of Al-Qaeda, a militant Islamic extremist network led by Osama bin Laden. The attacks were planned by, or believed to have been planned by, terrorists in Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban government harbored Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. And these events were quite destabilizing, quite concerning for people. And it's always an interesting question to ask, why did Americans find these particular events so threatening? The post 9/11 events were considered particularly threatened because it was an international threat that actually exploited our open American culture to act on American soil with the intent of instilling fear that would alter the American way of life. It also seemed entirely possible at the time that further attacks would actually occur, which was somewhat confirmed with a subsequent anthrax letter that happened just days after the September 11th events. And this concern of vulnerability in the homeland would motivate efforts to eliminate the threat in the countries of origin. So if you'll remember, beginning on September 18th, there were actually letters containing anthrax spores that were mailed to news outlets and to the office of U.S. senators, killing 5 people and affecting just 17, just days after the September 11th attack. Interestingly, though never solved for certain, it's now believed that those letters were actually mailed by a U.S. bioweapons expert that was concerned about elimination of a defense program. I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked down those buildings will hear all of us soon. And this is a fairly famous quote by then President George W. Bush. He made that quote on September 21st, just a few days after the September 11th attacks. And I always ask people to think about, do they remember where he was when he made these comments? This event is known as the Bullhorn Moment. This was an ad hoc comment made by President Bush while standing atop the World Trade Center rubble just days after the September 11th attack. And the statement combines 2 powerful sentiments. First, there is a consoling message that spoke to the rare political and social unity felt at the time. I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you. But the second part is interesting. It's essentially a declaration of pending retribution, and actually indicates plans may have somewhat been in motion, even just days after the attacks. President Bush was the former governor of Texas. He was the son of a powerful political family that included a former president. George W. was elected in 1999. The September 11th attacks occurred just 8 months into his first term, and their related conflicts would largely dominate the remaining 7 years of his presidency and the term of the next 3 presidents. So then we move on to the war in Afghanistan. On October 7, 2001, in response to the September 11th attacks, the U.S. led a multinational coalition to invade Afghanistan with a handful of objectives. The first objective was to end that Taliban rule. Second was to destroy the terrorist training camps. And the third was to capture al-Qaeda leaders. Taliban and al-Qaeda leaders were mostly expelled from the country, though it's arguable that some of them simply moved next door to Pakistan. The coalition mission changed shortly after that. So they were able to accomplish some of these objectives. They ended the Taliban rule. They destroyed terrorist training camps, largely expelled the Al-Qaeda leaders. But yet we would remain in Afghanistan for almost another 20 years. And that was because the coalition mission changed. So the mission became to support a new democratic Afghanistan government and prevent the harboring of terrorists in the future. There was resistance to that coalition that emerged in the form of an insurgency, and that would ensue for the remainder of the time of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. This conflict was actually just one part of a larger effort by the U.S. that swore to eradicate terrorism in any place that it existed, and that became known as the Global War on Terrorism. And I just want to share some details on that photo. You can see that is a photo of U.S. service members firing artillery on a Taliban position on October 22nd, 2008, from Camp Blessing in eastern Afghanistan. Much of the combat in Afghanistan occurred in mountainous regions from small, remote forward operating bases. So you can see that base is really only a couple of acres. It's located near an Afghani village, and you'll see a significant amount of mountains in the background. I think it's important to point that out because when we say the Middle East or when we think about these countries and conflicts, we actually envision a very different place, with flat horizons, a dry climate, hot climate, and that's not exactly what all the U.S. service members experienced. After the war in Afghanistan, we begin a war in Iraq. March 20th, 2003, using rationale that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, the U.S. led a rapid invasion of Iraq. Some even expressed concern at the time that this invasion began, that they were worried that this was actually distracting from the war on terrorism. It wasn't exactly sure whether there was a connection between those that instigated the September 11th attacks and the country of Iraq and the Saddam Hussein regime. So they were concerned that we may be actually distracting from that larger global war on terrorism. But regardless, operations proceed. The objectives for the war in Iraq included, in the Saddam Hussein regime, eliminate Iraq's WMD, or weapons of mass destruction, secure Iraq oil fields, and enable representative self-government. So most of these objectives to me read very typical, right? It is to end the enemy's regime, it's to eliminate a weapons threat, and it is to establish a self-governing entity. However, the fourth one, secure Iraq's oil fields, seems different than the others. And I think sometimes that expresses maybe some of the motivations. However, many would have argued that the purpose of securing those oil fields was to secure a future for the country of Iraq, to allow it to function. On December 13, 2003, Saddam was captured and later tried in an Iraqi court and executed. The U.S. occupation tends to exacerbate some of those tensions that existed among the religious and ethnic groups, such as the Sunni, Shiite, and Kurdish groups. And there's actually an insurgency that ensues in Iraq as well to resist the U.S. presence and compete for authority in that country. The picture, that is a statue of Saddam Hussein with the U.S. flag being draped over it. This was a fairly famous picture from this time period. This is a picture of Lieutenant Tim McLaughlin, who was actually given this flag by Senator Chuck Schumer for his aid to victims on September 11th. So McLaughlin was actually at Ground Zero. He was a public safety officer in the community and helped respond to those attacks. He was awarded that flag for what he did. McLaughlin brought that flag to Iraq, and on April 9th, 2003, so just at the height of the invasion, the flag was draped over the statue of Saddam as U.S. forces seized Baghdad. That image went viral, to the chagrin of some, and shortly after this photograph was taken, it was replaced with an Iraqi flag. And the reason that this image became so volatile is some was concerned that it represented American occupation, right? We wanted to, or the US and coalition forces wanted to project an image of liberation, that we were liberating the people of Iraq. And this tended to imply that we were there to occupy the country, which is why the flag was shortly replaced with an Iraqi flag afterwards. In 2013, the National Marine Corps Museum in Virginia contacted McLaughlin, requesting to display the flag in an exhibit. McLaughlin actually declined the offer, stating he felt the photograph and the flag had become a symbol with unintentional meaning. And the flag actually remains locked in a safety deposit box by Mr. McLaughlin. So then we approach the end of the wars. Iraq, in 2006, an Iraq study group finds that the situation in Iraq is actually grave and deteriorating. It was getting worse. President Bush shortly announces the surge, which was to add an additional 20,000 soldiers. And at the same time, he begins discussions for withdrawal of U.S. forces in Iraq. In 2011, there is a formal withdrawal that occurs. And not long after that, we do have large portions of the region fall under the influence of ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And U.S. forces actually have to return back to Iraq for a period to help mitigate that threat. However, we also in Iraq do have a tenuous democracy that is established. So Iraq holds regular elections, and the country's various religious and ethnic groups enjoy some forms of representation in the political system. However, democratic governance is impeded somewhat by corruption and continued security threats. In Afghanistan, in 2011, bin Laden was actually located and killed. 2018, the U.S. begins secret peace negotiations with the Taliban, actually excluding the Afghan government that we had stated was a mission to support. On September 20th, 2021, the U.S. withdrew the final 640 service members, and there was an evacuation of U.S. allied Afghans at the Karzai International Airport. And that's the fairly recognizable image you'll see is those Afghanis that helped support and worked for U.S. coalition forces attempting to board the plane to leave the country. And shortly after the U.S. withdrawal, the Taliban returns to take control of the country. So how were the post 9/11 conflicts unique, or were they unique? So a couple of conclusions to think about. In post 9/11 conflicts, we had what's called a limited force. Throughout both conflicts, U.S. policy limited the size of the force to the absolute minimal amount believed necessary to accomplish the mission. Rather than substantially grow the size of the U.S. Army, planners had to rely on existing soldiers available. Rather than committing resources to recruit a larger volunteer force or implement a draft, a regular rotation of existing units was implemented. So an active duty unit could expect to deploy every 2 years, while a National Guard or reserve unit would be deploying every 5 to 6 years. This often resulted in numerous deployments for any one individual even as they moved to new units. For National Guard units, this often meant sometimes deploying the community's only doctor or chief of police, so it had a significant impact. Another item is the counterinsurgency warfare. This is defined as military actions taken against irregular forces. So rather than large land battles between national armies, counterinsurgencies involved conflicts with unidentified combatants moving around the civilian population. U.S. forces had to establish a vast network of bases and forward operating stations, each surrounded by civilian populations that may or may not harbor enemy combatants. And the challenge was to win the hearts and minds of those local civilian populations so that they would no longer harbor or support the insurgents. There was a reliance on locals. So in both conflicts, Iraq and Afghanistan, withdrawal was contingent on establishing functioning democratic governments. This required the training of new national armies and other institutions to assume operations, allowing the U.S. to depart. To win the hearts and minds, U.S. forces employed locals to provide basic services. Additionally, locals were used as interpreters. This resulted in unusually strong bonds between U.S. service members and those locals that they worked with almost every day, while simultaneously there was a concern regarding disloyalty of these individuals and even corruption among the locals. Locals that supported the U.S. forces faced uniquely intense threats. They were traveling each day to work with U.S. service members while their families would still be located, and it was largely known that they may be working for U.S. forces. These conflicts also saw advanced medical treatment. Medical treatment of wounded had advanced substantially since World War II or the Vietnam War. So rather than death, post 9/11 veterans often healed from their immediate physical injury. However, this often resulted in a more immediate return to battle and increased the percentage of those that were maimed or survived with permanent injury or loss of appendages. We also had what was called embedded reporters. The Department of Defense adopted a new method for interacting with the media. So rather than deny media access to combat, which was the case in previous war, reporters were embedded. They were encouraged to go with U.S. service members. This meant they were provided seemingly unfettered access by living among U.S. service members. How even at the time, some questioned the ethics of this. They questioned the idea of allowing that they were concerned that allowing media in this capacity would influence its objectivity because the media would be reliant on service members for their security and often bond with service members as they were traveling with them. There was new digital forms of communication, such as email, social media, video conferencing, that allowed service members to communicate with family immediately and more frequently. However, these digital forms do not lend themselves well to long-term preservation. So in short, fewer letters home means less written record of service members' experience. It's difficult to preserve emails or social media posts, and in some ways, we may have a slightly less robust written record of these conflicts than what we did when we consider the letters and correspondence from World War II or other conflicts. In that picture, you see a photograph of Lieutenant Dan Luckert of Necross, Georgia. He actually had one leg blown off, as well as part of his other foot when a bomb exploded under his Humvee in Iraq in 2008. So advancements in prosthetics or artificial limbs actually allowed Luckert to return to combat in Afghanistan in 2010, just 2 years after severe injuries and loss of a limb. So some would wonder whether this is actually a good idea. What does this do to a soldier that experiences this kind of injury to return to combat quickly? Lieutenant Luckert wanted this. He embraced the idea of getting back to his fellow service members as soon as he could. But some expressed general concern that this may not be the best decision for a soldier. So what does it mean to be a post 9/11 veteran? So some data that I'm going to share some data that some of those veterans experience. So 1 in 5 veterans today served after 9/11. Their experience is markedly different than those of previous generations. A Pew Charitable Trust study from 2019 found that 57% of combat veterans say they witnessed someone in their unit either wounded or killed. 61% report troubles paying their bills. 41% report struggling with alcohol and substance abuse. In 2021, Brown University estimated the total cost for caring for post 9/11 veterans was at $2.5 trillion, and that includes the disability and medical care for the next 50 years. Sometimes I think when we consider these types of military actions, there are estimates that are produced of what the cost of invading a country might be. And I don't know that those costs are always applied to what is the cost of providing the healthcare for those individuals in those conflicts for the next 50 years. Suicide rates among U.S. veterans is greater than the general population. A study of Brown University in 2021 indicates that 17 suicides per day occur among veterans. For post 9/11 veterans, this is often attributed to traumatic brain injury resulting from those improvised explosive devices, explode near a vehicle and jostle the individual inside the vehicle. Attributed to exposure to stress due to multiple deployments. Advanced medical treatment resulting in sometimes longer service. And even one item that was noted was the American public's limited understanding of post 9/11 conflicts. So some of these veterans would indicate that they would go through this extraordinary experience, return home to sometimes a community that really had little knowledge of what the conflict was. So I want to move on to a little bit of telling the story. The act of telling one's story or communicating an experience can be a powerful tool. For the teller, it gives them a feeling of empowerment and provides a type of therapy by reflecting on one's experience. For the listener, it can demonstrate appreciation and allow greater understanding of a loved one's motivation. And telling one's story can occur in many forms. It can be as advanced as it can be as simple as an informal conversation among friends or even acquaintances, or it can be a more formal oral history interview project that preserves valuable information for research that informs future decision makers. However, for some, engaging in conversations about their experience can be, well, it can be intimidating. During the Kansas Stories of the Vietnam War Oral History Project, we often heard from family members that the service member never talked about their experience before. Service members often told us, no one ever asked. I just wanted to move on. I didn't want to burden anyone, or they wouldn't understand. A desire to move on is valid, and sometimes we even prematurely commend that idea of moving on. Military service overseas, away from family, is disruptive, no matter what the role, leaves deep impressions. Studies indicate unresolved or unaddressed emotional issues can manifest later in life in unrecognizable ways that range from insomnia to marital tension to substance abuse. Concern that others would not understand, I'd say, is also valid and probably correct in most instances. However, this provides an opportunity for the average citizen to research and gain knowledge on the subject matter in order to engage in meaningful conversations. So what do we mean by informal conversations? It's just a discussion with veterans. But to kind of help that process, I put together a few do's and don'ts. This is kind of based off of my experience. Other veterans may have a different experience, but these are some do's and don'ts when engaging in informal conversations with veterans. So do start a conversation. Good starter questions are as simple as, did you serve in the military? Where were you stationed or assigned? You might ask them if they have a moment, and you could go into deeper questions like, how long did you serve? What type of work did you do? In the military, this is called a military occupational specialty, or MOS, and every soldier has one of these. And they're often well trained in them and excited to talk about them. Did you go anywhere interesting? Did you have family members that serve? Because they often do. Veterans love acronyms. Ask them what an acronym means. They'll be more than thrilled to tell you what an acronym means. I always encourage people to kind of manage your feelings as they come up. You may hear some things that you didn't expect and some things that cause emotional reaction in you. Just try to attempt to manage those as you're having that conversation. Thanking veterans for their service is kind, but a brief conversation can often be more meaningful. So some don'ts. Don't immediately express your opinion on war or how veterans should be treated, or shift to conversations of politics. These are important topics, but sometimes it's best to let those conversations occur at a later time. Relating stories of veterans in your family is fine, but avoid dominating the conversation with the accomplishments of service members in your family. Really give the veteran you're talking to a moment to talk about their experience. Don't ask the veteran if they've ever killed anyone. This is a question that occurs. And in some ways, I kind of understand where this comes from. I think this is sort of driven by film and popular perceptions of war, in which death is sometimes regaled as a heroic action. I'm not making a judgment on that. I'm just saying that's an event that is a personal matter, and it's probably best to avoid asking that question. You don't have to explain why you didn't serve. Many members of civil society are unable to serve, and you don't need to justify why you didn't serve. Avoid asking the veteran if they were in combat. It implies that the experience of someone that didn't face combat is of less value. I always think a better question to ask is, were they deployed? Or what countries have they been to, and what did you do? So we talked a little bit about what informal conversations with veterans can be. It can be just a simple conversation. Another alternative is a more formal oral history project with veterans. And those are recording, transcribing interviews with veterans with the intent of preserving that information for future researchers. So some things to do is schedule a time and share sample interview questions in advance. Explain how the interview will be used and ask them to sign a release form or state permission in the recording. And this is really to document an individual's consent to sharing their story. Find a quiet place to record and set up equipment in advance. There are several web-based applications for recording oral histories. Ensure your equipment is functioning. I can attest it's problematic if you've scheduled a time, they've taken time out of, the veteran has taken the time out of the day to interview you, you've started down the process and you realize that your equipment is failing you. That's not a great situation to be in. Ask the veteran to bring pictures, uniforms, or objects. These are actually really useful tools for recalling memory. Using a photograph and asking him to describe those individuals in the photograph actually triggers memories for the veteran themselves. Do transcribe the interview afterwards. And when we say transcribe, is we're talking about writing or typing out the actual discussion so that there is a written record. This can be very time-consuming to transcribe these. There are some modern techniques and modern web-based applications that can make that process quicker. But it's important to remember that the transcription is really the valuable aspect, right? It allows future researchers to read and understand this rather than attempt to watch, sometimes 2 hours of video footage. It allows them to read the written word. Provide a copy of the interview to the veteran afterwards. Some don'ts, unless necessary, generally avoid interviewing the veteran with family members present. And I know that sounds sometimes counterintuitive, but veterans will often filter their story when their family members are present, or they will tell one set of stories when the family member is there, and they'll tell a different set of story when the family member is not there. Sometimes that is because there may be shame involved, or they may be concerned of sort of frightening their family members. So it's really most useful to do that when the family member's not in the room with them. Avoid asking about aspects in which the veteran did not have first-hand knowledge. So don't ask them questions about something that they didn't witness themselves. During this Kansas Stories of the Vietnam Veterans, a question continually came up about, what do you think about Jane Fonda? Which was really interesting. Many of the veterans expressed that they really weren't there. If Jane Fonda came to North Vietnam during the war, it was really quite shocking at the time. Many of these veterans didn't witness that event, and so it put them in a weird position of trying to talk about something they didn't necessarily witness. Don't forget to ask the veteran to state their name, years of service, and service branch on the recording. These are really essential pieces of information for future researchers. And don't feel compelled to record lengthy conversations in one setting. It is perfectly fine to do multiple settings when recording these conversations. I'm going to wrap up here with just some resources that can be useful for these oral history projects. There's the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, provides really great instructions on how to record and submit personal stories, actually submit them to the Library of Congress so that they can be available for future resources. StoryCorps application. So StoryCorps is a national nonprofit organization that records all types of oral histories, and they're really skilled at editing them down into short, consumable stories that can be shared. They're often broadcast on public radio, but they can be available for listening online. They have a really useful app that an individual can use to record stories with other family members. So these are just some tools. So I do thank everyone for hearing me talk about the post 9/11 veterans. I think their stories are important, and I always appreciate a moment to talk about them. So Sarah, I think I'm done. If
Great. Well, thank you, Morel, for that presentation. This is a good time for you to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. And we have about 10 minutes or so remaining in our hour for Merle to answer your questions. So go ahead and throw those in there. But I do have one to start us off. I didn't realize, I learned from your presentation that the military costs include the healthcare for veterans for 50 years. That's really interesting. And so in light of that, given the increased levels of disabilities and instances of post-traumatic stress, has the veterans care system in the US adapted to address this?
So that's a really good question, right? And that's a number of 2.5 trillion estimated for healthcare. That is a cost that's really attributed to the veterans healthcare system. The short answer is no. In some ways, the veterans healthcare system, I don't think was really equipped to support this whole generation of veterans from the post 9/11 conflicts as they returned back to civil society and maybe exited the military. And both of these conflicts sort of demonstrate a long history of war making in America, in which there's a lot of energy put into the conduct of war and often little regard given to the treatment of service members afterwards. And you can see this dates back to the Civil War and World War I. So after each of these conflicts, you often would see service members had to go to Washington, D.C. to essentially fight for benefits and health care. We do see some recent progress. In 2022, Congress passed the PACT Act, or the Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxics Act. And that was meant to significantly improve the healthcare access and funding for veterans who were exposed to toxic substances during military service. So this both included was sort of a corrective action for many Vietnam veterans that were exposed to toxic chemicals like Agent Orange. But this also allowed service members from the post 9/11 conflict, allowed more categories of benefits that they could apply for. It's kind of well known for the burn pits, right? So when I showed you the picture of the forward operating base, Camp Blessing in Afghanistan, it's a small base. And to dispose of waste in those bases, there was a burn pit in which this was an approved method to get rid of the waste. We've now learned that it was probably unwise to be burning trash in those compounds, and it was exposing people to a lot of things that may have residual effects later down the road. And this act really made some significant improvements. Really, it allowed a lot more type of these ailments to qualify for disability and for benefits and treatment.
Interesting. So you're a historian. Historians hate to predict the future, but how do you think historians are going to remember these post 9/11 conflicts?
Yeah, that's really difficult to say. And I think it's interesting because, we think of September 11th, we are just reaching sort of beyond 20 years. So while there has been a lot written about these conflicts and the global war on terrorism, from a journalistic perspective, really only historians are really only now kind of diving into the critical analysis of this period. I think that's for lots of reasons. I think generally it is useful to establish some distance from an event, which allows historians to have a sort of objective ability to research that. But like on a more logistic level, I think we are just now beginning to study this because you have to allow a certain period of time for people to write their memoirs, right? For soldiers to do oral history projects. You have to allow the record, sort of the written record, to grow. And you even have to allow time for records to become available that were maybe classified or unavailable or just now being discovered. So really some of the best literature on these conflicts, the best academic or critical analysis of these, gosh, is really only being published within 2022 or 2023. But to your question, and I can really kind of only state like sort of my historical look at this, I think these conflicts will definitely be remembered in mixed ways. I think it's part of that global war on terrorism, which was really a response to the 9/11 attacks. 9/11 attacks were so fundamental and such an existential threat for every member of society during that period. It was really hard to live in a world in which we did not react to that. And it had to be an appropriate reaction. And so for policymakers, a terrorist attack on homeland soil was really new territory. They didn't know exactly how to process that information. So they really felt like they had limited options to an existential threat. So, whether they made right decisions or wrong decisions, we have to think about at the time that these decisions were being made. I feel like Iraq in some ways will likely be remembered probably as an overreach. If you'll remember, it ultimately, we never found those weapons of mass destruction. We learned that some of the intelligence that was based on was faulty. So I think that may be remembered as a bit of an overreach, and I think in some ways the Afghanistan conflict will be a disappointment, right? Because we worked to provide democracy, to eliminate an oppressive government, only to see that government oppression return shortly after. However, I think for the veterans themselves, not to try to be positive, but I think these will be remembered as the veterans as unique experiences that demonstrated how fragile a thing like democracy can be and how difficult it is to establish those types of institutions. I think studies indicate veterans typically have a high level of civic engagement. They vote more often. And I think this in some ways provided them a more rounded experience of how fragile our institutions can be when we see how difficult they can be to establish elsewhere.
Speaking of veterans, we have a question about whether there is camaraderie among younger veterans, similar to what there was with the World War vets. There are organizations created, the VFW, American Legion, to bring the veterans of previous wars together. But the question is, are they attracting these younger veterans, or is there something else taking the place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We see a lot of veterans report experience of post-traumatic stress, and it's really quite challenging. I think all veterans from all conflicts, whether we call it shell shock or PTSD, they're all it's the same thing. And for veterans after World War II, had these sort of fraternal organizations like VFW and American Legions, these veterans-based organizations. They weren't therapy, but they were therapy, right? It was a way for people who experienced things to talk about their experience in a space that they felt was safe. And I don't think we have that quite that same thing today. So for these post 9/11 veterans, I think many of them become involved in those organizations, but not at the level that they did after World War II, which is problematic, right? Because in some ways they're operating without that same fellowship. They're not able to have those to share those stories with other veterans in the same way. So I think it is not to our advantage that we don't have the same robust participation in these veterans organizations.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. And this is also in line with veterans. And do you know of any veterans who have discussed, maybe either informally or through a formal oral history interview, or has there been any research done on their experiences of the change in rules of engagement in post 9/11 warfare?
So not, well, I'm not aware. So rules of engagement are usually rules that are defined. They can be different from conflict to conflict. And they really give soldiers or service members, they're literally what they are, rules of engagement. Here are the things, the conditions that you have to see before you can fire your weapon, before you can take lethal action. And those can be tailored for different circumstances and different situations. Sometimes they, in a perfect world, those rules of engagement would remain static throughout a given conflict because it becomes very confusing if those change or evolve in the middle of a conflict. And for both of these, I mentioned that the missions often changed. So they would go from sort of an invasion force to a stability force, and those would result in a change of those rules of engagement. I think some of the oral histories that I've listened to, so like the Veterans Oral History Project of the Library of Congress, you can actually listen to some of those and veterans talk about their experience. And concepts like rules of engagement is frequently referenced because they are, they're significant. So you will hear veterans talk about them. Sometimes they were cumbersome. They felt sort of hemmed in by those. They were frustrated sometimes when those changed. But as to whether somebody has deliberately studied the impact of those rules of engagement on veterans members, that I could not answer that.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Merle, thank you so much for your presentation tonight, for all the information you shared. We are so glad to have you back with at least for the Historical Society briefly here tonight with your presentation. And thank you to everyone who attended tonight. And we hope that we'll see you next month for our next month's program.